At my daughter's wedding, her arrogant fiancé grabbed the back of my neck and smashed my face into the three-tier wedding cake. He laughed into the microphone and said, "Try some dessert, Beggar. Let us not have people saying I let my father-in-law starve." The crowd gasped, but before I even wiped the frosting from my eyes, the most ruthless real estate tycoon on the East Coast jumped from the VIP table, pointed a shaking finger at him, and shouted, "Are you out of your mind? He is a billionaire." The fiancé went white as a sheet. He had absolutely no idea that just 3 hours earlier, I had moved quietly and methodically to purchase every single dime of his enormous, carefully hidden debt, wiping him out from under his own feet, without him ever sensing a thing. I pulled back on the heavy manual transmission of my rusted 2003 Chevy Silverado, easing her down. The old engine let out its low, familiar groan, a sound I found oddly comforting as I guided the truck along the steep, perfectly manicured, winding driveway that curled up toward a lavish Newport, Rhode Island estate. My hands wrapped around that worn steering wheel were thick-weathered and deeply calloused. They were the hands of a man who had spent 40 years assembling a global shipping and commercial real estate empire from the ground up, beginning with absolutely nothing but a single rusty tugboat riding the freezing swells of Boston Harbor. I did not inherit a dime of what I had built. I bled for every dollar of it. I gave up my youth, my sleep, and eventually my marriage to erect a fortress of security around the people I love most. And yet, it never sat right with me to make a show of any of it. Wealth was something I carried quietly. I still drove my old truck the same as I always had, and I intended to keep right on doing so. Welcome to His Hidden Revenge. I am glad you found your way here. If these stories of patience, truth, and justice move something in you, I would love it if you stayed with me by hitting like and subscribing. And before we go any further, what are you up to right now? While you listen, cooking dinner, taking a long drive, or maybe just resting after a hard day? Drop it in the comments. I love knowing who is in the room with me. A quick note before we begin. Some elements of this story have been shaped for dramatic effect, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. It is the heart of the message that I want you to carry with you. I still polished my own boots. Resting on the cracked leather seat beside me was the wedding invitation heavy printed on outrageously expensive cardstock with raised gold foil lettering. An invitation to the wedding of my only child, my daughter Sloane. We had drifted into a deep silence over the past 15 years, ever since the bitter collapse of my marriage to her mother, Vivienne. Vivienne was a woman who loved the idea of wealth and high society far more than she ever loved the man who bled himself dry providing it. When we split, she set about poisoning Sloane's mind against me, casting me as a work-obsessed mechanic who cared more about cargo ships than his own flesh and blood. Tucked inside that gleaming envelope was a small yellow sticky note. Not a word of warmth or excitement from my daughter. Just a hastily scrawled line from Vivienne. It read, "Try to look decent, Garrett. Stand in the back." I parked my beaten-up truck near the far edge of the lot, deliberately keeping it hidden in the shadows between gleaming Porsches, imported Mercedes, and chauffeur-driven luxury SUVs. I cut the engine and let the quiet settle over me for a moment. Then I stepped out, drew a slow breath of salty ocean air, and smoothed down the lapels of my suit. It was a clean, well-pressed navy suit from JCPenney that I had bought 15 years ago. My boots were old steel-toed mechanic boots. I had polished them until they gleamed, but they were still deeply scuffed at the toes from years of walking cargo ship decks. They were comfortable, and more than that, they kept me grounded, a constant reminder of exactly who I was and where I had come from. I walked slowly toward the grand, towering entrance of the estate. Valet attendants in crisp white shirts darted frantically to open doors for women wrapped in designer gowns and men strutting in tailored tuxedos. The wealth on display was deafening. But to a man who truly has money, that kind of loud, desperate flaunting always reads as performance. As I reached the sweeping stone steps, a younger man moved directly into my path and planted himself there. He was immaculately turned out in a custom-fitted navy suit that likely cost more than my first car. His hair was slicked back perfectly, and his posture radiated the particular arrogance of a man who had never truly earned anything. This was Donovan Ashford, the man my daughter was about to marry. I had never formally met him, thanks to Vivienne, keeping me completely shut out of Sloane's adult life. But I recognized his face from the handful of photographs I'd come across online. Donovan looked me up and down. His eyes swept over my outdated suit and dropped immediately to my scuffed mechanic boots. A look of profound disgust moved across his face, as though I had dragged mud through his personal kingdom. He sneered, letting out a short, dismissive sigh. Without a word of greeting or the slightest trace of basic decency, he reached into his tailored pocket, produced a set of keys on a heavy leather keychain, and shoved them aggressively toward my chest. "Here, take the keys to my car," he said, his voice thick with condescension. "Easy on the clutch. It's worth more than your life. Park it near the front. I want my guests to see it." I did not reach for the keys. I kept my hands resting quietly at my sides. I stood perfectly still, spine straight, and looked him dead in the eye. I let the silence stretch between us, watching the irritation build on his polished face as I refused to move. "I am not the valet," I said. My voice was calm, low, and steady, carrying the weight of a man who has negotiated with ruthless union bosses and international tycoons. "My name is Garrett Wyndham. I am Sloane's father." The keys slipped from his outstretched hand and clattered sharply onto the stone driveway. For just a moment, the arrogant smirk disappeared completely from Donovan's face. He blinked, clearly caught off guard, staring at me like an unwanted stray that had wandered into a palace. But the shock didn't hold long. Within seconds, that practiced smile climbed back onto his face, tight, forced, drained of any real warmth. "Right," he chuckled uneasily, crouching quickly to retrieve his keys from the cold stone. "Sloane mentioned you might actually show up. I just didn't expect you to look quite so authentic." He did not offer his hand. He did not say it was a pleasure to meet the man who had given life to his future bride. Instead, he turned and snapped his fingers sharply at a security guard posted near the heavy wooden doors. The guard jogged over, expression tense. "Keep a close eye on the old man," Donovan ordered, not bothering to lower his voice. "Make sure he doesn't drift into the VIP lounge or start pestering the catering staff for free food. We have very important, very wealthy investors arriving shortly, and we cannot have any embarrassing distractions." The guard gave me a cautious, almost apologetic look and nodded. Donovan turned his back on me completely and crossed toward a cluster of well-heeled guests, laughing loudly and clapping them on the shoulder as if I had ceased to exist. I stood there on the steps, a cold ocean breeze pressing against my face. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a scene. I simply watched him go. That single brief exchange told me everything I needed to know. A man who treats a stranger with that much contempt, purely because he believes they have no money, is a man concealing something very dark and very fragile behind that expensive suit. I slid my hand into my pocket and felt the smooth casing of my encrypted satellite phone. The wedding weekend had barely begun, and already I knew that Donovan Ashford had made the gravest mistake of his life. The game was in motion. The grand dining hall of the estate was a masterclass in aggressive opulence. Crystal chandeliers poured warm light over tables draped in imported silk. Elaborate floral arrangements rose high above the guests, spilling over with rare orchids that cost more than a modest family's monthly grocery bill. A jazz trio played softly in the corner, laying down a sophisticated backdrop to the clink of champagne flutes and the boastful laughter of the coastal elite. It was the hollow theatrical display of wealth that Vivienne had always craved. I found my assigned seat, a small, unsteady chair, wedged into the furthest corner of the vast room, positioned directly beside the swinging metal doors of the kitchen. Every few minutes, a waiter burst through those doors, bringing a wave of hot air and the clattering chaos from inside. I had been placed as far from Sloane and the main wedding party as the room would allow. They had tucked me into the shadows, deliberately hoping I would stay unseen. It was a calculated insult designed to make me feel profoundly unwelcome. I pulled out the chair and sat down quietly, resting my calloused hands on my knees. I didn't complain to a soul. A man who truly knows his own worth never needs to demand a seat at the center of the room. I watched the elite guests move and mingle around me. To them, I was just an old man in a dated suit with scuffed boots and unfortunate blemish on an otherwise flawless aesthetic canvas. Then Donovan's family made their grand entrance. They took their places at the head tables, but not before steering deliberate detours past my dark corner. Donovan's mother, draped in ostentatious jewelry, glanced down at my boots and let out a sharp, audible gasp. She leaned toward her sister and whispered, not quietly at all, "Can you believe he wore those hideous work boots to a formal dinner? It is absolutely disgraceful. Donovan is kind to even allow that riffraff inside the building." They talked about me as though I were either deaf or simply too beneath them to register their cruelty. I felt a familiar, steady calm settle across my mind. In 40 years of building a global logistics empire from nothing, I had faced down ruthless international cartel bosses and walked away standing. The petty snickering of these sheltered socialites registered as less than nothing. I took a slow sip of water. Fools always laugh the loudest right before the ground gives way beneath their feet. My ex-wife Vivienne made her way across the room. She wore a sleek designer gown, her face arranged in a pleasant smile. But as she drew closer to my table, that smile dissolved, replaced by a cold, hardened stare. She stopped beside my chair, her posture rigid with a resentment that had been aging for years. "I told you to stand in the back, Garrett," she said, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "But you just had to come inside and ruin the aesthetic. You look like a homeless person who wandered in off the street. I am only here for my daughter." Before I could respond, she reached into her expensive silver clutch and drew out a crisp folded $100 bill. With a sharp, aggressive motion, she forced the money into the breast pocket of my old JCPenney suit. She patted the pocket twice, a condescending little gesture that made my jaw tighten. "Take that," she whispered, venom coating every word. "Use it for gas on the way back to whatever trailer park you're calling home these days. Leave early tomorrow. We don't need your poverty dragging down the wedding photos." She spun on her heels and swept back toward the bright lights. She was waiting for me to cause a scene wanted me to, so she'd have the excuse to have me thrown out entirely. I didn't give her the satisfaction. I reached calmly into my breast pocket and drew out the folded bill. I smoothed the sharp creases flat against the table. Just then, a young busboy came bursting through the swinging kitchen doors. He couldn't have been older than 19, hauling a massive tray of dirty dishes, his arms shaking under the weight of it. He looked wrung out and visible to every laughing wealthy guest around him. I knew exactly what that felt like. I remembered pulling back-to-back double shifts on the freezing docks of Boston Harbor, hands cracked and bleeding, scraping together just enough to keep the heat on. In those days, a single bill could stand between eating and going without. Real wealth has nothing to do with an offshore account. It lives in the bone-deep knowledge of what hard work actually costs. I never let myself forget that. As the young busboy rushed past my table, I quietly slid that crisp $100 bill beneath the edge of his tray. He stopped dead, looking down at it in disbelief. When his eyes found mine, they were wide and full of something genuine. I gave him a small nod and pressed a finger to my lips. He mouthed a silent thank you and disappeared back into the noise of the kitchen. With that settled, I turned my attention to the center of the room. Donovan was holding court at the main table, surrounded by an eager, admiring audience. He was putting on the performance of a lifetime. He signaled aggressively to the waitstaff, demanding 3 more bottles of vintage champagne be brought over. Those bottles cost $1 or $200 apiece. He poured freely, laughed loudly, playing the careless, untouchable billionaire hedge fund manager with absolute conviction. But a man who has spent decades reading people sees what ordinary eyes miss entirely. I watched Donovan carefully stripping away the shiny, expensive armor of his act with every passing minute. The head waiter approached from behind him, leaning down to discreetly present a leather-bound checkbook with the preliminary charges for the rehearsal dinner. Donovan kept that wide, arrogant smile fixed in place for his audience. But when he flipped open the leather booklet and his eyes dropped to the total, I caught it. A microscopic reaction yet to my trained eye, it rang out like a gunshot. The muscles along his jaw clenched hard. A trace of color drained from his cheeks. His hand trembled just a fraction before he gripped his glass tighter to hide it. His eyes made one quick, panicked sweep of the room, the look of a cornered animal hunting for an exit. He signed the receipt, fast-shoved the booklet back at the waiter, with unnecessary force, his fake smile returning a beat too late. I settled back into my wobbly chair by the kitchen doors, the roar of the upscale party receding into the background. My gut was speaking loudly now, sharp and impossible to ignore. The lavish theatrical spending, the unearned aggression, the sheer terror that flashed across his face at the sight of a restaurant bill. This boy was no billionaire. He was sinking fast, and my only daughter was about to chain herself to his listing-doomed ship. I waited until Donovan was momentarily absorbed by a cluster of fawning bridesmaids before I made my move. I rose from my unsteady chair and threaded my way through the sea of silk gowns and tailored tuxedos, searching for my daughter. I spotted Sloane standing near a towering floral arrangement of white peonies. She was breathtaking in her evening gown, but there was a subtle tension locked into her shoulders, a stiffness that had no business being on a bride the night before her wedding. I crossed to her slowly, my boots making a soft, steady sound against the polished hardwood. When she saw me, she stiffened further. Her eyes flicked quickly over my shoulder, checking whether anyone important was watching. "Hi, Dad," she said, her voice dropping to an anxious whisper. "You should probably stay seated. The parents are circulating." "I just wanted to give you this," I replied gently, keeping my voice level despite the cold welcome. I reached into the side pocket of my suit jacket and brought out a small, intricately carved wooden jewelry box. It was crafted from rich mahogany, the very same wood I had salvaged from the first commercial cargo ship I ever purchased decades ago. I had spent 3 weeks sanding it by hand in my private workshop, working the surface until the grain shone like glass. On the lid, I had carefully engraved her initials, just as I used to carve her name into the little wooden blocks she played with as a child, back before the divorce tore our daily life apart. I held the box out to her. "I made it for you to keep your new ring safe." Sloane looked down at it. For one fleeting instant, a flicker of real unguarded warmth moved across her face. She remembered, but that warmth was swept away almost instantly by a wave of visible embarrassment. Her eyes darted around the crowded room in barely concealed panic. Rather than opening it to look at the work inside, she grabbed the box from my hands and tried to push it down into her small designer clutch. It wouldn't fit. She fumbled with it, her cheeks going red. "Thank you, Dad," she said quickly, eyes fixed on the floor. "I'll put it away later. Please just go sit down before Donovan sees us together." It was already too late. Heavy, deliberate footsteps closed in from behind. A thick wall of expensive designer cologne announced Donovan Ashford's arrival before a single word left his mouth. "Well, what do we have here?" Donovan called out, his voice cutting through the soft background music like a blade. He stepped between Sloane and me, his cold eyes locking onto the mahogany box still held in her hands. "It's nothing," Sloane stammered, shrinking under his gaze. "Just a small gift from my father." Donovan didn't ask. He reached out and snatched the wooden box straight from her grip. He raised it toward the chandelier, light turning it over with exaggerated mocking scrutiny. A slow, cruel smile crept across his clean-shaved face. "Did you make this yourself, old man?" he asked, rotating the box carelessly between his fingers. "Looks like something you'd come across at a cheap flea market or a dusty garage sale." I kept my expression completely neutral, hands folded calmly in front of me. "I carved it from solid mahogany. It's a family tradition." Donovan threw his head back with a loud theatrical laugh, the kind designed to pull the attention of every nearby guest. "A tradition," he repeated, shaking his head in exaggerated pity. "Well, Sloane and I have far better traditions now. Traditions that come in little blue boxes from Tiffany & Co. We don't have much use in our penthouse for homemade arts and crafts." Sloane looked away. She couldn't meet my eyes. She didn't defend me. She didn't reach for the box. She simply stood there in silence, too afraid of disrupting the man she believed was her wealthy savior. Donovan flagged down a passing waiter, carrying a tray of fresh drinks. He lifted a heavy crystal glass of dark, expensive whiskey and took a long, arrogant pull from it. Then he looked back at me, that smirk full of cold malice. Without dropping my gaze for even a second, he set the mahogany box down on a nearby cocktail table. Then, with slow and deliberate contempt, he brought his sweating whiskey glass down hard onto the carved lid. "Makes a fantastic coaster, though," Donovan said, a vicious gleam in his eye. "Thanks for the little contribution, Garrett. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have actual guests to attend to tonight." The condensation from the glass was already pulling at the polished wood, threatening to undo every hour of work I had pressed into it. Every primal instinct I possessed, every ounce of raw authority I had built as a man who commanded massive boardrooms and dismantled hostile corporate takeovers, without breaking a sweat, screamed at me to seize him by that custom-tailored collar and tear his fake world apart right there on the spot. But I held back. A predator never lunges when the prey is still testing its footing. I needed him to feel completely untouchable. I drew a slow, measured breath, ready to simply lift the heavy glass off the lid and walk away. Before my hand could even reach it, the mood in the room shifted without warning. The disruption didn't come from me. A man muscled his way past the floral arrangements and bore down directly toward our small corner. He was no invited guest. He wore a cheap, heavily scuffed leather jacket over a dark, wrinkled t-shirt. His face was rough and weathered, his nose slightly crooked, and his eyes carried the flat, dead calm of a man who earned his living collecting dangerous debts. He paid no attention to the surrounding socialites and walked straight up behind Donovan. Without a word, the man in the leather jacket shot out a hand and seized Donovan's tailored shoulder. The grip was brutal. Donovan wheeled around, fast mouth already open, to fling an insult, his arrogance fully primed to obliterate whoever had dared touch him. But the instant Donovan's eyes landed on that face, his entire mask crumbled. The color drained out of him completely, leaving him the shade of old chalk. His jaw trembled. The booming voice that had just finished humiliating me dissolved into nothing. He was utterly speechless. The man shoved Donovan forward. He stumbled, eyes blown wide with naked terror, as the stranger pushed him hard into a dark, completely empty hallway just behind us. I watched the door swing shut, swallowing the light. The music played on a soft, floating melody that felt entirely disconnected from the quiet violence I had just witnessed. Not one other person in the room appeared to notice a thing. The wealthy guests continued to clink their champagne flutes and laugh at their own jokes, blissfully unaware that the groom had just been manhandled by a thug in a leather jacket. I turned back to Sloane. She was standing rigidly beside the floral arrangement, smoothing the fabric of her gown with nervous hands. Her breathing was shallow, and her eyes were fixed hard on the hardwood floor. She had seen every bit of it, yet she was working desperately to perform as though nothing at all had happened. I moved a slow step closer, keeping my voice low so as not to startle her. I asked her who that man was and why he had laid hands on Donovan with such force. Sloane pressed a bright artificial smile onto her face before turning to look at me. When her eyes finally met mine, they were fiercely guarded, shored up by years of the status-obsessed conditioning her mother had drilled into her. She let out a short, dismissive laugh and waved her hand. "Oh, that's just a frustrated contractor," she said, smoothly reciting the lie with the rehearsed precision of someone fed a specific script. "Donovan manages a $50 million hedge fund, Dad. He's a very important man in the financial district. People are constantly after him for investments, and sometimes they get a little too aggressive when he turns them down." I absorbed her words in silence. A $50 million hedge fund manager does not get shoved into dark hallways by frustrated contractors. A man holding that kind of power has a security detail, or at the very least, the composure to stand his ground in public. Donovan had folded like wet paper, his eyes screaming in primal terror. But Sloane needed to believe her version of it, needed it to keep her carefully constructed fantasy intact. She lifted her chin, adopting that familiar imperious posture Vivian had spent years perfecting. "Donovan is operating at incredibly high stakes all the time." She went on, her voice sliding into something almost patronizing. "It's a completely different world from what you're used to, Dad. He carries enormous pressure because he's building a future for both of us." Before I could press her on the obvious cracks in her story, Sloane lifted her left hand with deliberate pride. She spread her fingers outward, angling them to catch the full light from the crystal chandelier overhead. On her ring finger sat an ostentatious stone, easily 3 carats set in a thick platinum band that looked cumbersome on her hand. She gazed at it with an expression of pure reverence, treating it less as a symbol of love and more as a glittering passport to a higher social tier. "Donovan had it custom made just for me," she said, her voice carrying a smug, satisfied edge. "He wanted to make absolutely sure I had the best. He told me a woman of my caliber deserves a diamond that commands respect the moment she enters any room." I looked from the ring up to my daughter's face. The sharp, judgmental stare she was giving me was a flawless copy of her mother's. Then she delivered her carefully aimed blow. "He is giving me a life you never could, Dad," she said, her voice cold and flat. "A life where I never have to worry about the smell of motor oil or settling for less. You could learn a great deal about success from a man like him." I swallowed the bitter surge that rose in my throat. There is a particular kind of agony in hearing your own child speak to you with that level of contempt. It lands like a physical weight, pressing down on your sternum. I had spent 40 years deliberately forgoing my own comfort, grinding through 80-hour weeks to build a global shipping network from nothing, so that she would never once feel the cold grip of poverty. And yet, here she stood, utterly convinced that my worn mechanic boots were a mark of failure, rather than the very bedrock her privileged life was built on. I did not raise my voice. I did not rush to defend the balance of my hidden accounts. Instead, I let my attention settle quietly on the stone resting on her left hand. "May I see it?" I asked, keeping my tone gentle and mild. Sloane hesitated briefly, visibly caught off guard by the absence of any confrontation in my response. She held her hand a few inches closer, arm kept stiff and guarded. I leaned in, narrowing my eyes and studying the large stone under the unsparing light of the chandelier. In the late 1990s, my international shipping company had landed a major contract, moving raw diamonds out of South Africa to the top jewelers across the United States. For 5 straight years, I personally oversaw the logistics of those multi-million-dollar shipments. I spent long hours in secure vaults alongside master gemologists, absorbing exactly how to read the unmistakable qualities of a genuine stone. I learned about internal fire, the specific aggressive way a real diamond bends and refracts, light throwing brilliant flashes of deep color from its solid core. I stared hard at the stone on Sloane's finger. It was undeniably large cut, with clean mathematical symmetry and flawless to any untrained eye. But as the chandelier light swept across the polished facets, something in my gut fired immediately. The refraction was wrong. Rather than the fierce living brilliance of a genuine diamond, the light bouncing back off that stone was flat, glassy, and dead. There was no internal fire. It was brilliantly shiny on the surface, but hollow all the way through. A well-cut piece of cubic zirconia, completely fake. My heart dropped heavy with the weight of what I now knew. The truth struck me with the force of a freight train at full speed. My daughter wasn't simply marrying an arrogant, unpleasant man. She was binding her entire future to a desperate, dangerous fraud. A man who boasted loudly about a $50 million hedge fund, but couldn't cover the cost of a real diamond for his own bride. A man who had just been physically muscled into a hallway by a street-level debt collector in the middle of a secured Newport, Rhode Island estate. The fake ring, the terror in his eyes, the aggressive bluster masking a rising tide of panic. It was all a brittle, carefully assembled house of cards built on nothing but desperate lies, and Sloane was standing in the very center of it. I had to act. I released Sloane's hand, gently letting her step back into the shelter of her illusion. She smoothed her silk gown, offered me a defensive nod, and slipped away into the crowd of tailored tuxedos. I stood alone beside the floral arrangements, letting the full weight of it settle over me. My only daughter was marching headlong into a burning building, fiercely defending the man who had lit the match. I turned and made my way back to my isolated chair by the swinging kitchen doors. The jazz trio had gone quiet, their music replaced by the crisp ring of a silver spoon against a crystal champagne flute. The low murmur of elite conversation tapered into expectant silence. At the front of the grand hall, bathed in the light of the largest chandelier, stood Donovan Ashford. He held a glass of vintage champagne in one hand and a wireless microphone in the other. He radiated a toxic manufactured confidence that only a truly desperate man can sustain. He let the room go completely still before he spoke, savoring the undivided attention of every wealthy guest in the room. "Thank you all for being here tonight." Donovan began, his voice rolling through the speakers with a practiced cadence. "Tomorrow, I marry the most beautiful woman in the world. But tonight, I want to talk about legacy, about what it truly means to build an empire from the ground up, to be a man who shapes the future rather than simply existing inside it." He moved back and forth across the front of the hall, making deliberate eye contact with the most affluent investors seated at the front tables. "Some of you know that my hedge fund has been aggressively pursuing a monumental commercial acquisition for the past 6 months," Donovan continued. "It has been a grueling war of attrition against some of the oldest money in this city. But I am proud to announce tonight in front of my future bride and my closest allies that we have finally closed the deal." The room broke into eager applause. Vivian beamed from the front row, clapping with visible enthusiasm. Donovan raised his hand to settle them, a smug smile spreading across his face. "We just secured the primary commercial rights to Harwick Tower on Boylston Street," he declared, chest swelling. 50 stories of premium untouched Boston real estate, an absolute crown jewel, and it is officially ours. The applause surged again, louder this time. Donovan let it wash over him, feeding the hunger behind his eyes. Then his gaze swept the room. It bypassed the billionaires, the socialites, his beaming fiancée. It traveled all the way back to the dark, isolated corner by the kitchen doors, and it landed squarely on me. The microphone caught his soft, mocking chuckle. "You know, building a true legacy demands a certain kind of ruthless evolution," Donovan said, his voice dropping into a condescending drawl. "It demands leaving the old ways behind. I look around this room and I see the absolute future, but I am also reminded of the pathetic past. He paused for effect, tilting his champagne flute in my direction. Some men work until they are 70 years old just to afford a rusted pickup truck and a cheap suit. The silence in the room turned heavy. They break their backs for decades. Donovan pressed on, his voice dripping with venom, convinced that blind grinding labor will somehow deliver them to greatness. But true greatness is not earned by sweating in the dirt like a peasant. I made my first million at 25. I am acquiring Boston skyscrapers before I turn 35. Cheers to rapid evolution, and cheers to leaving the dinosaurs exactly where they belong, buried in the past. He hoisted his glass high. A few of his groomsmen snickered loudly, heads turning to stare directly at me in my dark corner. Vivian let out a short, sharp laugh and raised her crystal glass in enthusiastic agreement. The cruelty in the room was thick, a suffocating blanket of elitist contempt, aimed squarely at a man they had decided was a pitiable failure. I looked over at Sloane. She was staring down at her lap, her face pale, her hands knotted tightly together. She did not rise from her seat. She did not stand up for the man who had worked back-to-back freezing shifts on the docks to cover her childhood medical bills. She simply absorbed my public humiliation as the price of entry into Donovan's imaginary kingdom. I did not shift in my chair. I did not look away, and I did not betray a single flicker of embarrassment or anger. I reached out calmly, lifted my plain glass of ice water, and took one slow, deliberate sip. The cold slid smoothly down my throat, a perfect match for the ice that had just settled permanently into my veins. Donovan Ashford was no master of the financial universe. He was a reckless, deeply foolish child, playing a dangerous game he did not begin to understand. I had no need to run a corporate background check to know he was lying about his grand commercial acquisition. I had no need to involve my legal team to verify the current ownership status of Harwick Tower on Boylston Street. I knew exactly who held that deed. I purchased Harwick Tower 12 years ago during a devastating market downturn. I gutted the entire structure from the ground up, poured $60 million into rebuilding the commercial infrastructure, and placed it inside a private, heavily guarded holding trust strictly under the umbrella of Wyndham Enterprises. I am its sole owner. There are no outside investors. There is no hedge fund consortium, and there is absolutely no active negotiation for its commercial rights with anyone, least of all a petty fraud like Donovan Ashford. Donovan had simply plucked the most impressive, most visible building he could conjure to dazzle a room full of wealthy strangers. He had no idea that the actual owner of that building was sitting at the worst table in the room, wearing a 15-year-old suit and steel-toed mechanic boots. The lie was so staggeringly large, so effortlessly verifiable to anyone with real corporate reach, that it locked every dark suspicion I'd been carrying into certainty. The scattered pieces snapped together cleanly in my mind. Donovan was drowning in dangerous debt. He had a violent street-level debt collector crashing an exclusive rehearsal dinner. He had replaced a genuine stone with cubic zirconia, and now he was fabricating multi-million-dollar real estate deals from the stage of his own wedding weekend to paper over a crumbling illusion of wealth. He wasn't just deceiving my daughter. He was lying to his investors, his supposed friends, and whatever criminal element had lent him money and was now coming to collect. The dominoes were already tilting, and Donovan was dancing at the very bottom of the stack, completely blind to the destruction bearing down on him. He took another eager sip of his expensive champagne, basking in the glow of a kingdom that was never his. I set my water glass down on the table with a quiet, firm click. The paternal fury that had briefly surged inside me receded, entirely displaced by the cold, clinical focus of a corporate predator that has located its prey and is in no particular hurry. Let him drink his champagne. Let him soak up the applause he didn't earn. Let him believe he had just humiliated the old mechanic in front of the entire coastal elite. Tomorrow, the bill would come due, and I intended to collect every last cent. As the applause for his fabricated triumph finally began to fade, Donovan raised his hand to quiet the room. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced his sleek, expensive smartphone. He stared at the dark screen with exaggerated gravity furrowing his brow, as though an urgent message had just demanded his immediate attention. He leaned toward Sloane, murmured something in her ear, then addressed his audience one final time. "I am terribly sorry to step away from the celebration," Donovan announced, his voice heavy with performative regret. "But when duty calls, a man has no choice but to answer. I have a scheduled conference call with a rather influential senator regarding upcoming financial legislations on State Street. An absolute nuisance, I know, but these figures at the top simply don't recognize the concept of a weekend. Please enjoy the caviar, keep the champagne flowing, and I will be back momentarily. The guests responded with murmurs of impressed admiration, clearly captivated by his supposed political connections. Vivian nodded approvingly from the front row, eyes gleaming as she watched her future son-in-law command the room. Donovan gave Sloane a quick practice kiss on the cheek, straightened his tie, and moved toward the heavy glass doors leading out to the garden. But I caught something the room full of admiring socialites missed entirely. The moment Donovan turned his back to the crowd and stepped away from the bright lights, his broad shoulders dropped. The confident, arrogant swagger dissolved with every step he took into the dark. His breathing had gone shallow, and the fists hanging at his sides were wound tight. A man strolling away to take a call from a political ally moves with confidence. A man trudging toward the gallows moves exactly the way Donovan Ashford was moving right now. I counted off a full 30 seconds before I pushed back my wobbling chair from the table. Not a single soul gave a second glance to the old mechanic easing quietly out through the swinging kitchen doors. The kitchen crew was far too consumed with plating the next course to notice me threading my way through the narrow service corridor that opened directly onto the estate's back gardens. The night air bit crisp and clean, laced with the sharp, salty tang of the Atlantic. The ground sprawled out in a maze of precisely clipped hedgerows, pale marble statues and softly gurgling stone fountains, the whole scene washed in the gentle glow of the landscape lights. It was a stunning, peaceful place. Tonight, though, it felt like a hunting ground. I eased myself onto the cobblestone path, the thick rubber soles of my old work boots swallowing the sound of each step. I moved with deliberate slowness, hugging the deep shadows thrown down by the tall oak trees overhead. I did not have to look for long. The frantic crunch of gravel gave him away, coming from a dimly lit alcove near the edge of the property line. I settled myself quietly behind a dense row of tall, manicured hedges. From that concealed position, I had a clear, unobstructed view of the groom. Donovan was completely alone, and he was not holding the sleek, expensive smartphone he had been brandishing inside the dining hall. Instead, he was gripping white-knuckled and aggressive a cheap prepaid flip phone. His hands trembled violently as he punched in a number. The shift in the man was genuinely startling. The polished, untouchable billionaire was gone without a trace. What stood there in his place was a terrified, desperate child. Sweat caught the pale moonlight on his forehead. He clawed frantically at the collar of his custom suit, as though it were tightening around his throat. He paced back and forth on the gravel chest, heaving in deep, ragged pulls of air. He raised the cheap phone to his ear, every muscle in his body locked rigid. When the other end picked up, Donovan did not speak with the commanding weight of a hedge fund manager. He spoke in the high, wavering pitch of a man pleading for his very life. "Listen to me. You have to listen to me," Donovan begged, his voice fracturing with raw desperation. "I know what the deadline was, but you cannot do this tonight. Not tonight. I am literally standing at my rehearsal dinner right now. The wedding is tomorrow. You just need to give me a little more time. I swear on my life, I have everything completely under control." There was a brief silence while the other party spoke. Whatever they said made Donovan flinch as though he had taken a physical blow. He squeezed his eyes shut and dragged a trembling hand through his perfectly styled hair, wrecking the expensive look entirely. "I am not trying to avoid you," Donovan hissed, his voice collapsing into a frantic, hushed whisper. "I am telling you the absolute truth. I just need 48 more hours. That is all I am asking for. 48 hours. The moment I marry her tomorrow afternoon, the marital trust fund unlocks automatically. Her grandfather left behind a massive account, and as her husband, I will have full legal access to every single penny. You will get your $4 million back. I will throw in a substantial interest payment for the delay. Just please do not send anyone else to the venue. If you spook her family, you are going to ruin everything." Another heavy silence settled. Donovan absorbed the final chilling verdict from his ruthless creditor. A desperate, defeated gasp escaped him. "Please do not do that," Donovan begged, tears of sheer terror rising in his eyes. "I will have the $4 million by Monday morning. I promise you. Just let me marry the girl." The line went dead. Donovan stared at the cheap flip phone in absolute horror. A raw, guttural sound of pure frustration ripped out of him. He hurled the device violently against the brick wall of the estate, sending it apart in pieces. Then he drove his foot into a heavy landscaping stone, with everything he had, cursing loudly into the empty dark. He bent forward, palms on his knees, pulling in deep, unsteady breaths as he tried to paste his composure back together. I stood motionless behind the thick hedges wrapped in cold shadow. The blazing alarm that had been screaming in my gut had just been proven absolutely right. Donovan Ashford was no successful businessman. He was a colossal fraud who owed $4 million to genuinely dangerous people. He was using my daughter, planning to drain her protective trust fund the instant the ink dried on their marriage certificate. He saw Sloan as nothing more than a convenient, wealthy sacrifice to buy his own miserable survival. I turned away from the alcove and moved silently back toward the kitchen doors. I had heard everything I needed to hear. The season for gathering quiet clues was finished. It was time to initiate the secret moves that would protect my only daughter. I would reduce his hollow empire to ash and make certain he could never threaten my family again. The ruthless predator that lives inside me was now completely awake. I slipped back along the garden path, leaving Donovan to the ruin he had made of his own reality. When I re-entered the grand dining hall, the room had transformed. The formal dinner service was over, and the wealthy guests were drifting toward the marble dance floor. I watched from the shadows as Donovan made his entrance. He strode back into the room, with his arrogant swagger restored, tugging his suit jacket straight, that hollow smile fixed in place. He grabbed Sloan by the waist and pulled her out onto the dance floor. They spun together beneath the crystal chandeliers, the picture of absolute perfection. To anyone who didn't know better, he was a confident billionaire, savoring his last evening as a bachelor. But I knew the truth. I knew that under all that silk and cologne, he was drenched in the cold sweat of a man who owed $4 million to absolute monsters. Knowing the truth and convincing a brainwashed daughter of it, however, are entirely different wars. Sloan had spent 2 years submerging herself in Donovan's carefully constructed fantasy. She was not going to take the word of a father she saw as nothing more than a bitter old mechanic. If I confronted her armed with nothing but a story about an overheard phone call, she would go straight to Donovan. He would almost certainly talk her into eloping that very night, cutting me out of her life for good, and locking down access to her trust fund. I needed physical, undeniable proof. I needed hard evidence capable of shattering his illusion so thoroughly that Sloan could not look away from what was standing right in front of her. I turned from the dance floor and walked with purpose toward the grand foyer. I went out through the front doors, leaving the music behind. The circular driveway was a sweeping expanse of crushed gravel, lined with the most expensive luxury vehicles on Earth. I stood at the top of the stone steps and let my eyes move across that glittering sea of automotive engineering. I was looking for one specific car. Earlier that evening, Donovan had spent a full 20 minutes loudly boasting to older investors about his brand new custom-ordered Porsche 911. Every word out of his mouth had been a precisely engineered lie meant to blind the wealthy people around him. He called it a spontaneous purchase, a small reward to himself for closing the Boston commercial acquisition. I spotted the sleek midnight black Porsche sitting prominently near the front of the VIP row. I descended the stone steps and crossed to the valet podium. A young attendant moved forward. I reached into my pocket and produced another crisp $100 bill. I folded it deliberately and slid it across the wooden surface. I told the young man that my future son-in-law had accidentally locked a critical wedding document inside his Porsche and that I needed 5 minutes alone with the vehicle to retrieve it. The valet looked at the money, then at my steady, unyielding face. He pocketed the bill, discreetly placed the electronic key fob in my hand without a single word, and turned away to attend to another guest. I walked to the black Porsche and pressed the unlock button. The headlights flashed sharp in the darkness. I pulled the heavy door open and leaned inside. To anyone passing by, this car was the ultimate badge of financial success. But my entire life had been built around engines and how things actually work. I know how to see past a shiny surface. I settled into the low driver's seat and popped open the glove box. A man who genuinely owns a high-performance sports car keeps meticulous records, registration, insurance documents, service warranties, all neatly filed. The glove box was nearly bare, save for a single brightly colored manila folder. I pulled it free and clicked on the overhead dome light. I opened the cover and began to read what was inside. The logo printed at the top of the page belonged to no exclusive dealership or premium leasing agency. It was the mark of a notoriously shady exotic car rental outfit, operating on the outskirts of the city. I worked my eyes down the detailed rental agreement. Donovan Ashford had not purchased this car. He had not even leased it. He had rented it strictly by the hour. The contract spelled out a rigid 24-hour rental period beginning the previous afternoon and expiring tomorrow morning, right before the wedding ceremony. He had paid an outrageous predatory rate simply to have the car sitting in the valet line for a single night, all to prop up his fragile illusion of wealth. I folded the rental agreement and tucked it carefully into the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket. But something in my gut said there was more to find. A man this desperate always leaves a trail of panicked mistakes scattered behind him. I started working through the rest of the cabin. As I leaned across to check the passenger side floorboard, my hand caught on a crumpled, heavily creased sheet of bright yellow paper that had been shoved carelessly beneath the seat. I pulled it free and pressed the sharp folds flat against my knee. I held it up to the dome light. It was a formal legal document bearing the official seal of the city housing court. The thick black letters across the top read "Final Notice of Eviction." I read through the details below. The document was addressed directly to Donovan Ashford. It listed a small, deeply modest apartment in a rundown neighborhood, nowhere near the affluent financial district he claimed to command. According to the court order, Donovan was more than 6 months behind on basic rent. The landlord had obtained a legal judgment against him, and city marshals were scheduled to forcibly remove his belongings and lock him out of the property by next Tuesday. I eased back into the leather seat, the sheer scale of his deception settling over me like a wave of cold water. Donovan wasn't just broke, he was utterly destitute. The self-declared billionaire hedge fund manager, the man who had sneered at my boots, the man who spoke of buying skyscrapers in Boston, was literally days away from sleeping on the street. The expensive suit was almost certainly rented. The champagne was being billed to a fraudulent tab he had zero intention of settling, and his entire survival, his desperate scheme to pay off violent creditors and keep a roof over his head, rested completely on conning my daughter into signing a marriage certificate tomorrow afternoon. I folded the bright yellow eviction notice with care and placed it alongside the rental agreement in my breast pocket. I cut the dome, climbed out of the rented Porsche, and locked it behind me. I crossed back to the valet podium, returned the key fob to the young attendant with a quiet nod of thanks, and turned toward the estate. The night air suddenly felt electric against my skin. The crushing weight of uncertainty had lifted, entirely replaced by the cold, precise focus of a father girding himself for total war. Tomorrow, the grand illusion would come apart in front of everyone, and I would be the man swinging the hammer. I climbed the wide stone steps slowly. The cold air had stripped my mind clean. Every footfall felt deliberate, grounded. Back inside the main hall, the party had hit a fever pitch. The heavy wooden doors pulsed with the driving rhythm of loud dance music. I gave the crowded ballroom a wide berth. I had no interest in watching a roomful of oblivious socialites worship a false idol. Instead, I moved through a quiet, softly lit hallway toward the men's restroom. The heavy mahogany door was slightly ajar. The moment I pushed it open, the sound of the bass was instantly swallowed up, replaced by the harsh, echoing rasp of ragged, panicked breathing. I stepped inside without a sound, letting the door drift shut at my back. The restroom was a lavish display of marble and chrome, smelling sharply of cedar hand soap and Donovan Ashford's suffocating designer cologne. Donovan stood alone at the far end of the long vanity counter. His tuxedo jacket had been pulled off and dropped carelessly onto the spotless floor. His silk tie was wrenched loose and hung crooked around his neck. He was doubled over the polished marble sink, gripping its chrome edges with both hands, knuckles bleached white. He cranked the faucet to full and threw freezing water hard into his face. He gasped, shoulders lurching up and down as he fought to drag air into his terrified lungs. He was deep inside a full-blown panic attack. Every last piece of the untouchable billionaire's armor had dissolved, leaving nothing behind but a cornered animal. I stayed near the entrance, watching with cold, clinical detachment. He spat desperate, broken curses at his own dripping reflection in the wide vanity mirror. For a long moment, Donovan had no idea I was there. He kept hyperventilating, throwing cold water against his pale skin, trying to bully his nervous system back into submission. Then, as he raised his head to reach for a hand towel, his wild eyes swept across the mirror and landed on my reflection, standing directly behind him. The change was instantaneous and pathetic. Every trace of raw terror vanished from his face in an instant, buried under a sudden surge of manufactured rage. It was the bluster of a weak man who knows he has just been caught. He wheeled around, water still streaming from his chin and soaking into the collar of his dress shirt, his chest puffed out, eyes contracting into a hard, vicious glare. He came at me in 2 fast steps, dress shoes skidding slightly on the wet marble floor. "What are you doing sneaking around in here, you creepy old mechanic?" Donovan spat, his voice unsteady. "Are you stalking me now?" I kept my hands loose at my sides, my posture easy. "I am simply using the restroom, Donovan," I answered, my voice flat and even. "You look like you are struggling. Do you need me to call a doctor?" That straightforward observation snapped whatever thin thread of restraint he still had. The humiliation of being caught in that state by a man he considered beneath contempt pushed him over the edge entirely. Donovan lurched forward on a burst of hollow arrogance. He seized my lapels with his wet hands and shoved me hard backward. My lower back met the edge of the marble vanity with a dull, solid thud. I did not flinch. I did not lift my hands. I stood there like a wall of stone, completely unmoved by the frantic shaking force of a frightened boy. Donovan pressed in close, his face barely inches from mine. He reeked of expensive whiskey, stale fear, and cold sweat. "Listen to me very closely, you pathetic old man," Donovan hissed, spittle flying as he groped for authority. "I have been generous letting you sit in that dining hall tonight. I have tolerated your miserable presence because Sloane begged me to be a decent person. But this is my world. You do not belong here. You are nothing but a dirty mechanic who failed his family. I want you to stay out of my way tomorrow. You sit in the back row. You keep your mouth shut. And you do not embarrass my beautiful bride with your disgusting poverty. If you ruin my perfect wedding, I will personally destroy what little life you have left. Do you understand me?" He drove me back against the marble sink one final time, for emphasis, then abruptly released my lapels, stepping away as though touching my suit had left something foul on his hands. He stood there panting, waiting for me to shrink, apologize, or crumble with the submissive fear he so desperately needed. I gave him none of that. I simply looked at him, my face entirely empty. I reached up slowly and straightened my collar, smoothing the wrinkles his wet hands had pressed into the fabric. The silence in the restroom grew heavy and stretched thin. My complete failure to be intimidated frightened him far more than a thrown punch ever could have. A predator knows a lesser animal on sight, and somewhere in his hollow core, Donovan understood that his performance had collapsed completely. He swallowed hard, his throat working visibly. Without waiting for a word from me, Donovan spun around and snatched his tuxedo jacket off the wet floor. He shoved his hand blindly into his back pocket for his thick leather wallet, intending to cram some loose cash inside in a manic rush. But his hands were trembling too badly to manage even that. As he forced the leather wallet back toward the pocket of his tailored trousers, he missed the opening clean. The wallet caught the edge of the fabric, flipping awkwardly in his clumsy grip. He cursed under his breath, snatched it again, and drove it deep into the pocket. On the second attempt, it held. He pivoted sharply and stormed out of the restroom, sending the heavy mahogany door crashing shut behind him. The boom of it faded into the walls, and the lavish restroom settled back into absolute silence. Before I show you what I found next and what it would mean for everything Donovan had built around my daughter, I want to ask you something. If you discovered that someone you welcomed into your family had been quietly working against you from the very beginning, would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you hold your silence and let the truth do its own work? I stood at the marble vanity and let the quiet settle around me. My eyes dropped to the precise spot where Donovan had fumbled frantically with his expensive leather wallet just moments before. Resting flat and silent against the intricate geometric tile was a small rectangular slip of bright pink paper. It had drifted completely unnoticed out of his overstuffed wallet during his panicked exit. I moved forward, crouched slowly, and lifted the small slip between my calloused fingers. The heavy cardstock had a texture I recognized immediately. This was no restaurant receipt, no business card. It was an official pawnshop transaction ticket. I turned it over and read the faded black ink printed across the front. The ticket laid out in clear detail the recent sale of a vintage, instantly recognizable diamond necklace, pawned for a fraction of what it was worth, purely to fund a cubic zirconia ring. It was the final piece of physical evidence. I held the small pink slip up beneath the harsh, fluorescent light of the vanity mirror, My callous thumb moved slowly across the faded ink as my mind worked through the devastating information printed on that heavy cardstock. It was an official transaction record from a notoriously discreet pawnbroker operating deep inside Jewelers Row. The date stamped in the upper right corner was exactly 3 months ago. That was the very same week Donovan had formally asked for my daughter's hand in marriage. I studied the detailed item description, feeling a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The receipt did not simply list a generic piece of jewelry. It explicitly described the exact cut, clarity, and weight of a flawless 3-carat diamond. My breathing slowed as the full devastating truth locked into place. Donovan had not purchased a custom ring to lavish luxury upon my daughter. He had taken the antique family heirloom ring that Sloane's late grandmother had entrusted to him for the proposal. He had ruthlessly pried the priceless, flawless, generational diamond right out of its antique platinum setting. He sold her family's precious legacy for quick cash to rescue his own truly miserable life. Then, to cover his tracks, he had a cheap cubic zirconia mounted into her grandmother's original setting. He presented it to Sloane as a grand custom upgrade, preying entirely on her manufactured hunger for high society validation. She wore the fake stone proudly, with no idea that the real diamond, the very emblem of her family's history, had been handed off to a stranger for cash. I read the final payout figure printed boldly at the bottom of the pink slip. It was a substantial sum of liquid cash, more than enough to cover large, urgent personal expenses without hesitation. My mind immediately connected the date on the pawnshop receipt to another piece of the timeline. 3 months ago was the very same week Vivian had proudly boasted about Donovan securing this magnificent exclusive coastal estate for the wedding weekend. She had crowed to anyone willing to listen about how Donovan had generously paid the astronomical venue deposit entirely upfront in cash. The puzzle was now fully assembled. He had not drawn on hedge fund profits to fund this lavish rehearsal dinner. He had used the stolen cash from Sloane's own family inheritance to prop up his pathetic grand illusion. Sloane was standing at the edge of an absolute disaster, joyfully preparing to marry a deeply dangerous, utterly desperate fraud. The man she believed was a billionaire was in reality a penniless con artist actively fleeing violent criminals. He was using her to survive, planning to drain her grandfather's massive trust fund the very instant the wedding was legally finalized tomorrow. I folded the pink slip precisely in half and tucked it securely into my breast pocket alongside the rented Porsche paperwork and the legal eviction notice. I now held the complete, irrefutable blueprint of his entire dark deception. The urge to march straight onto the dance floor and drag him off it by his rented lapels surged hot through my veins. Every paternal instinct I possessed screamed at me to pull my daughter aside, lay the pink slip in front of the whole crowd, and tear his fake kingdom apart on the spot. But I forced my racing pulse to slow. I shut my eyes and drew a long, steadying breath in the quiet of the restroom. Acting on pure emotional impulse is how ordinary men lose wars. A true apex predator understands the absolute importance of timing, of leverage, and of overwhelming, undeniable force. If I walked out there now and told Sloane the truth, she would never believe it. Vivian's toxic materialism had worked on her for years. To Sloane, I was nothing more than the bitter, struggling father from the dusty trailer park trying desperately to sabotage her glorious rise into high society. She would look at the pawn receipt, and Donovan would spin another smooth, convincing lie without breaking a sweat. He would call it a complex investment maneuver, a temporary business arrangement, and she would swallow every syllable just to protect her dream. A single piece of paper was not enough to break the deep spell he had cast over her. I needed to back him into a public corner so tight that no amount of polished smooth talk could pull him free. I needed to let him raise his glorious pedestal as high as it would go, so the fall would shatter his facade beyond any repair. The tension in my jaw finally let go as my strategy sharpened into focus. I could not fight this battle wearing the costume of a forgotten mechanic. I needed to bring the full crushing weight of my actual financial empire down on top of him. I left the quiet restroom and moved directly through the laughing, vibrant crowd of wealthy guests without a word to anyone. I did not pause to look at Sloane, still spinning blissfully on the polished marble dance floor in the arms of a complete monster. I did not acknowledge Vivian, who was aggressively flagging down a passing waiter with her empty champagne flute. I simply pressed through the heavy front doors and walked out into the cool, dark night. I approached the valet, asked for my old battered pickup truck, and stood waiting in the damp, refreshing coastal breeze. When the young attendant brought it around, he gave me a faintly sympathetic, slightly pitying look, with no idea that he was handing the keys to a man who could purchase this entire estate with a single phone call. I settled into the torn driver's seat, turned the ignition, and let the familiar steady roar of the engine fill the cab. I rolled slowly out of the circular gravel driveway and left the bright hollow mansion behind. The drive back to my modest rented motel room on the edge of town was silent, focused, and entirely deliberate. Once safely inside the quiet room, I retrieved my encrypted satellite phone from my duffel bag. This was the private line I reserved for coordinating high-level global logistics and major corporate acquisitions. I dialed the direct number of my chief legal counsel, a brilliant, utterly ruthless attorney named Elliot. He picked up on the second ring, fully accustomed to late-night directives from me. I instructed him to immediately acquire the entire commercial debt portfolio of Donovan Ashford. Every loan, every outstanding marker, every legal obligation Donovan had ever signed, I wanted all of it transferred into my name. Elliot asked no unnecessary questions. He simply assured me the order would be executed without fault before the sun rose over the eastern seaboard. I ended the call and set the phone on the bedside table. I reached into my breast pocket and withdrew the pawn receipt, the rental agreement, and the eviction notice. I laid all three side by side on the cheap mattress. Tomorrow, Sloan would walk down the aisle expecting a fairy tale. What I was going to deliver instead was a devastating, unstoppable hurricane of absolute, undeniable truth. Donovan Ashford was about to lose everything. The cheap motel walls were paper-thin, vibrating slightly slowly, with the heavy sound of a passing semi-truck on the nearby highway. I stared at those three pieces of paper resting on the faded bedspread, the pawn receipt, the rental agreement, and the eviction notice. Elliot was already working the legitimate financial markets, acquiring whatever visible commercial debt Donovan had recklessly accumulated. But the frantic, panicked phone call I had witnessed in the garden demanded an entirely different approach. Commercial banks do not send men in cheap leather jackets to physically threaten clients at formal wedding rehearsals. That brand of aggressive intimidation belongs strictly to the violent shadow economy. This next phase required absolute security. I picked up my keys, stepped out of the dingy room, and walked back to my rusted 2003 Chevy Silverado, parked beneath a flickering amber street lamp. The coastal air was thick with salt and heavy fog. I climbed into the familiar driver's seat and locked the heavy metal doors firmly behind me, sealing myself inside the quiet, insulated cab. I reached down beneath the worn floor mats and released a hidden reinforced steel compartment. I pulled out my primary encrypted satellite phone. This device was completely untraceable, entirely off the public grid, and reserved exclusively for the most critical high-stakes operations of my global empire. The number I punched in was encrypted at multiple levels, routing through international relays. The connection snapped open within seconds. This call had nothing to do with Elliot. This one went to Callum Sir Callum, the razor-sharp fixer and chief legal enforcer, operating through Wyndham Enterprises' most shadowed divisions. Mergers and press statements were beneath him. He lived in the territory of hard international pressure and consequences. His voice came through the line like gravel dragged across stone, unhurried, authoritative brooking, nothing. I need a level 1 pull on a man called Donovan Ashford. I told him, my voice stripped of everything except precision. Ignore every public record he has. Go straight to the underground lending networks working the tri-state corridor. Already moving, Callum answered, smooth and immediate. What's the specific target? There's a $4 million marker floating in the shadow market with his name on it, I said. Monday morning deadline. Collectors are already showing up at his public events to rattle him in person. I want that paper, Callum. Find whichever criminal outfit is holding it. Then acquire it, clean run everything through our untraceable shell structure. Whatever the cartel or the loan sharks are demanding for that marker, offer them double in offshore funds, no questions. When the sun comes up tomorrow, I need to be the one who owns Donovan Ashford's life outright, every obligation, every threat, every inch of it. The connections will be made within the hour. Sir Callum replied, his certainty absolute and immediate. The debt title and full legal transfer will sit inside your blind trust long before the banking sector stirs. I set the satellite phone down on the empty seat beside me and pressed my head back into the worn headrest, eyes fixed on the fog-blurred windshield. Outside the parking lot, lamp threw warped, stuttering shadows across the pavement. My mind churned through the architecture of the trap I had just sprung. Vivienne had spent the better part of 2 decades drilling one poison lesson into my daughter's head that power announces itself in marble and gold, in labels and price tags in the size of a man's watch and the label stitched inside his jacket. She had shaped Sloane into someone who genuflected before the hollow spectacle of a man like Donovan while looking straight past the unglamorous grinding labor that actually holds the world together. Donovan himself was the purest expression of that bankrupt philosophy. His entire existence was a stage set, a fake diamond, a rented car, a fund that existed only on business cards. Every piece of it engineered to produce one effect, the unshakable appearance of dominance. Underneath nothing, no girders, no bedrock, just a beautiful shell balanced over empty air, already beginning to crack. Power that is genuine doesn't require a dinner party audience. It doesn't need to make a mechanic feel small just to feel tall itself. What genuine power looks like is this: a man alone in a dark truck at 3:00 in the morning. No audience, no performance, placing a single invisible call that purchases another man's fate. Wholesale debt and freedom and future all bundled together. I breathed in slowly, then out, and let the rhythm of it bring order to the fire still burning behind my sternum. The rage was real. It had been real all evening, but it was banked, now controlled, directed. This was not about punishing Donovan Ashford out of wounded pride. This was a father performing the only surgery that could excise the cancer threatening his daughter's life. Sloane would despise me for it, at least for a while. She would rage and weep and almost certainly declare me dead to her. None of that changed the arithmetic. A father's duty is not to be liked in the moment, it is to keep his child safe across the years, whatever the bill. The dark hours crawled past in the cold stillness of the cab. Slowly the coastal fog began thinning at its edges, and a dim gray warmth started seeping into the horizon from the east. Then the satellite phone buzzed hard against the seat. I snatched it up. "Consider it closed." Sir Callum said, his tone clean and businesslike. The syndicate sitting on that $4 million marker was more than ready to walk away. Ashford had all the hallmarks of a runner. They'd seen it before. We moved exactly $8 million through the secondary offshore vehicle. Every piece of documentation they held, the digital marker, the physical blackmail collateral, it's all been transferred. It now belongs to you permanently and without contest. Did the seller probe at all about who was on the other side? I asked, watching pale gold light begin to touch the dented hood of my old truck. "Not even slightly," Callum replied. "They were purely delighted. Doubling a criminal investment in a single night tends to suppress curiosity. As of this moment, Donovan Ashford carries a $4 million personal debt to you, callable on your word alone, immediate and non-negotiable." "Good work, Callum," I said, keeping my voice level and quiet. "Hold close. I'll need you again before the day is out." I ended the connection and returned the phone to its reinforced compartment beneath the floor mat. The leverage I had required was now completely irrevocably mine. I climbed out of the truck and crossed the lot back to my motel room. A wedding demanded preparation. I shook out my clean, well-pressed navy suit from JCPenney that I had bought 15 years ago and laid it across the bed. I worked polish into my heavy steel-toed boots until they caught the light. Then I arranged the 4 pieces of evidence in a neat row: the pawn receipt, the rental agreement, the eviction notice, the digital debt confirmation, folded each one with care, and set them aside. Dawn pushed through the coastal haze and leaked in pale strips through the thin curtain. I stood at the cracked bathroom mirror and did up each button on the navy suit. The material felt rigid against my skin, a world away from the Italian wool waiting back home. I laced the steel-toed boots tight. Then I collected that folded quartet of documents: pawn receipt, rental agreement, eviction notice, and the record of Donovan Ashford's criminal debt, and slipped them into my breast pocket. Against my chest, they carried the weight of something live and loaded. I pointed the truck toward the coast and drove. By the time I reached the estate, organized chaos had already taken hold of the grounds. Florists were hauling and positioning towering clusters of white roses. Catering teams hollered back and forth as outdoor tents went up across the lawn. I tucked the truck quietly near the service entrance and kept well out of the traffic. Invisibility was the strategy right up until the moment it wasn't. 10 minutes at most had passed when Vivienne came into view. She was crossing the grass at pace, a clipboard wedged under one arm, snapping directives into a silver earpiece. The stress of manufacturing perfection had drawn every feature of her face tight. Then her gaze found me, and something colder than stress moved in behind her eyes. She cut off whoever was on the line and came straight at me. "Garrett standing around looking decorative as usual," she said, her voice coated in contempt. "The delivery truck is sitting at the back gate right now with all the ice for the reception bars. The catering crew is trying to tack on an extra $200 to unload it themselves. We are not burning money on basic manual work when this venue is already costing a fortune. Get back to that loading dock and unload those 60 bags of ice yourself. At least do something worth your presence here today." I studied her face for a moment, the thin, satisfied cruelty of it. A man who manages global freight networks could end a $200 dispute with a single sentence. But a man executing a perfect trap wears the costume the enemy has assigned him. So, I said nothing. I swallowed whatever my pride had to say, dropped my chin in a quiet nod, and turned toward the gravel dock at the property's rear. Vivian and Donovan needed to feel untouchable, certain that my submission was real and total. The refrigerated truck sat rumbling at the back gate, rear doors wide stacked pallets of commercial ice waiting in the cold interior. Each bag weighed 40 lb. I pushed back my sleeves and exposed forearms that had done this kind of work for 50 years. I grabbed the first bag by its top, levered it up onto my shoulder, and started the long walk across the grounds toward the reception tents. The cold cut through the suit fabric immediately and settled into my joints. I fell into a breathing pattern, measured, deliberate, the same rhythm I had first found long ago, hauling freight on the freezing docks of Boston Harbor. I was carrying the fourth bag across the open courtyard when a crack of loud, contemptuous laughter broke from the stone patio overhead. Donovan Ashford materialized from the main house, flanked by a tight cluster of 4 groomsmen, each one dressed in a matching custom-tailored suit, crystal glass of morning mimosa in hand. They surveyed me from their elevated balcony, the way feudal lords once looked down at field hands. Donovan leveled a manicured finger in my direction, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his freshly shaved face. "Get a look at this gentleman," he called out, pitching his voice deliberately loud enough to carry down to where I stood. He draped himself over the ornate stone railing and shook his head in theatrical commiseration. "Told you we had our own personal pack mule for the weekend." The groomsmen detonated into laughter. One of them, a tall man with slicked back hair, hoisted his glass in a mocking toast. "Pick up the pace, old man," he called down. "That champagne won't chill itself. Move it before you snap something." I did not break stride. I did not glance up at the balcony. I kept my chin down and my expression hollow, playing the broken, defeated father with complete conviction. I let the meltwater drip down my collar and soak into my shirt. I hauled the 5th bag, then the 10th, then the 20th. My shoulders burned and my fingers went numb against the biting cold of the ice. The physical punishment was real, but it was nothing, absolutely nothing, against the white-hot focus blazing inside my skull. Every time those men laughed, every time Donovan hurled another degrading jab from his comfortable perch, I felt something else entirely, a faint, steady pulse vibrating against my thigh from deep inside my trouser pocket. My encrypted satellite phone was running silent updates from the Wyndham Enterprises command center, each buzz a precision strike landing somewhere inside Donovan's crumbling empire. Buzz. Our shell corporations had formally executed the transfer of his $4 million criminal debt into our possession. Buzz. The underground syndicate had cleared the offshore wire and severed every tie to Donovan Ashford permanently. Buzz. Our legal team had obtained the orders necessary to freeze all 3 of his active bank accounts using the leverage we now held. Buzz. We had filed a formal fraud referral on his fabricated hedge fund with the Federal Financial Regulatory Commission. The trap was not simply closing anymore. It was snapping shut with the kind of force that leaves nothing to reconstruct. I shouldered the 30th bag and moved through the rose garden, the groomsmen's laughter trailing behind me. They had no idea they were mocking a man who now held absolute dominion over every breath Donovan drew. I carried the 40th bag. Vivian glided past me, letting her eyes linger on the dark sweat patches spreading across my old suit, her smirk saying everything she chose not to bother voicing. I lifted the 60th and final bag. As I hoisted it up, my phone delivered one long, unbroken pulse, sustained, deliberate, unmistakable. The final confirmation had arrived. Callum had secured the ultimate instrument of destruction. I walked the last bag to the outdoor bar and dropped it heavily into the steel cooler. I straightened up slowly, working the stiffness out of my spine. The labor was done. The humiliating performance had run its course. I rolled my damp sleeves back down and fastened my jacket. The sun had climbed fully above the horizon, flooding the estate in hard, golden light. The ceremony was fewer than 3 hours away. I lifted my eyes toward the stone balcony. Donovan was still posted up there, grinning arrogant, blissfully unaware that he was already a condemned man who simply hadn't received the news. I turned toward the guest seating area, ready to watch everything come apart. The coastal estate had reinvented itself as a monument to high society extravagance. Enormous floral arches constructed from white roses and imported orchids flanked the central aisle on both sides. A jazz trio played softly in the corner beneath the broad canopy of an oak tree, their notes drifting across the morning air in easy, unhurried waves. Guests poured in steadily, designer gowns, bespoke suits, the quiet confidence of inherited money. They gathered on the manicured lawn, trading pleasantries over sparkling water, while the ocean glittered behind them. I positioned myself near the back of the seating area, invisible in my damp, inexpensive suit, just another body in the background. Vivienne worked the crowd like a general on a parade ground, distributing her practiced social smile, making certain every prominent arrival understood that she had made all of this possible. Then I caught a glimpse of Sloane. She stepped briefly onto the upper balcony of the main house, ringed by bridesmaids and makeup artists moving around her in controlled urgency. Even across that distance, the happiness on her face was genuine and radiant, the kind that comes from believing completely in something. She gazed down at the gathering below, drinking in the spectacle of the day she had been promised. It hollowed me out to watch it. She had no idea the man she was preparing to marry had engineered every moment of this to use her. She believed she was walking toward a future built on love and security. She was walking straight into a snare. I pressed my thumb to the face of my heavy silver watch. 30 minutes remained before the ceremony was due to start. The crowd was swelling with joyful noise, but my attention was locked entirely on the tactical sequence Callum had laid out. I slipped away from the gathering, guests moved past the usher station, and followed a narrow cobblestone path that traced the outer edge of the estate. It curved behind the catering tents and terminated in a secluded shadowed alleyway running along the back of the main service kitchen. The noise of the kitchen clattering metal, shouted instructions softened as I stepped into the cool shadow of the brick corridor. This was a dead zone, invisible from the gleaming perfection of the ceremony grounds. I stood still in the damp coastal air and waited. 60 seconds later, exactly on schedule, a black sedan rolled silently up to the service gate and stopped. The man who climbed out bore no resemblance to any delivery driver. He wore a dark fitted suit, dark glasses, and an earpiece. Every movement he made telegraphed the unhurried efficiency of a trained corporate operative. He located me in the shadows without searching and came straight over, stopping precisely 3 feet away. He reached inside his jacket and produced a thick black leather folder, its surface stamped with a small, discreet silver crest, the mark of Wyndham Enterprises. He placed it in my hand, without a word, gave me a single measured nod, and walked back to the waiting car. The sedan reversed without sound and disappeared down the coastal road. I was alone in the alleyway. I set my shoulders against the cold brick of the kitchen wall and drew a slow breath. I broke the wax seal and opened the folder. The document stacked inside represented the full harvest of the night's work, every thread of the investigation pulled together into one dossier. I braced for predatory loan agreements, extortionate interest clauses, explicit threats tied to the criminal underground. What I found instead stopped the blood in my veins. This deception was something far more monstrous than I had conceived. Donovan Ashford had not simply borrowed $4 million to sustain his elaborate performance. He had not merely pledged his own name against a violent creditor's marker. He had committed deliberate, calculated identity theft against my daughter. My eyes moved across the collateral agreement at the center of the dossier. Her full legal name sat there in stark black ink. Below it, her precise social security number. Below that, the highly sensitive routing information for her generational marital trust fund. Donovan had forged her signature on the syndicate's primary collateral documents, designating my daughter without her knowledge, without her consent, as the sole financial guarantor for his criminal debt. If he defaulted on the $4 million, the syndicate would not come for him. Those forged documents gave them full legal authority to strip her trust fund to zero. He had spent 2 years manufacturing love, presenting counterfeit diamonds, parking rented cars in front of her, all purely to gain the intimate access to her private financial records required to execute this theft. She was never a partner to him. She was the instrument of his survival, a cold that had nothing to do with the coastal air settled deep into my bones. The moment for watching was finished. I drew the encrypted phone from my pocket and dialed. He picked up on the first ring. "Callum," I said, my voice dropping into a register that was very quiet and very dangerous. The black folder was in my possession. I had read every word of the collateral agreement, her signature forged, her identity weaponized to secure the entire marker. "I saw it myself," Sir Callum answered, his voice unhurried and composed. "What he pulled off is a breathtaking level of outright fraud. Our digital trail is airtight. He broke into her private financial records exactly 3 days before he pushed through the illegal loan. Every exit is sealed. Move on the purchase now." My eyes swept the crowded courtyard on the far side of the alley as I spoke. "Pour every available offshore dollar into this. The price is irrelevant to me. Acquire the debt. Make the transfer happen. When this is done, I own everything this situation. This man, his entire trajectory." "The wire is moving as we speak," Sir Callum reported. "The cartel has walked away from all claims. Every dollar of debt tied to Donovan Ashford, his crooked contracts, his leveraged future belongs to you alone. The man is yours." I killed the call and tucked the phone away. The folder sat against my palm like something loaded and ready to fire. The sprawling web of treachery Donovan had spent so long weaving was unraveling toward its final violent moment. I left the shadow of the alley behind and moved back into the open daylight. The time had come. Sloane's wedding was waiting for me. What unfolded at that coastal venue was nothing short of a masterclass in performance, every detail, polished, every movement, choreographed. I settled into the furthest seat in the last row, surrounded by neat lines of white folding chairs, watching my daughter give herself to a man who intended to tear her apart. Sloane was radiant in her gown, her expression open and luminous as she spoke her vows. Donovan embodied the role of the devoted, deeply emotional billionaire groom without a single false note. He cradled her hands, pressed a solitary, rehearsed tear from his jaw, and vowed to be her shelter and her provider for the rest of their lives. Gasps of delight rippled through the front rows. Rich guests leaned into one another, visibly moved by the romance playing out before them. I felt nothing of the kind. I occupied my corner of that back row in silence, the weight of the black leather folder solid against my ribs. The moment the ceremony broke, the crowd drifted effortlessly into the climate-controlled outdoor reception tents. Walking inside felt like stepping into another world. Enormous crystal chandeliers blazed above perfectly appointed tables, pouring warm gold light across every surface. White tuxedoed waiters glided through the crowd, with silver trays stacked with premium champagne and artfully plated food. My place card pointed me to a small, poorly lit table, jammed into the far back corner of the tent, right against the swinging kitchen doors. Vivienne had engineered my seating, deliberately keep the mechanic out of sight, away from anyone who mattered. She had no idea she had handed me the single best seat in the house to watch everything collapse. The luxury of the evening seemed to untether Donovan from whatever thin thread of caution he had left. Glass after glass of the costliest champagne the bar offered disappeared into him, and with each one his certainty that his schemes were bulletproof grew louder and uglier. He toured the dance floor like a general surveying conquered territory, arm around his groomsman voice full of bravado and cruelty dressed up as humor. He was convinced he had seized everything he ever wanted, the $4 million that would get the violent criminal syndicate off his back, a beautiful wife beside him, and a clear path into her enormous generational fortune. Nothing and no one could touch him. Dinner wound down, and the bright ring of silverware against crystal cut through the conversation, calling the room's attention to the toast. Donovan lunged for the wireless microphone out of the bandleader's hand and confidently strode to the absolute center of the polished marble dance floor. The speech that followed was velvet smooth, practiced stories, well-timed laughs, just enough performed vulnerability to work the crowd. He heaped praise on Vivienne for her taste and her loyalty, never pausing to acknowledge that every comfort he enjoyed had been bought with money he had stolen. Then he turned to Sloane and poured out a honeyed speech about how completely she had taken hold of him. Applause rose through the tent, but that wasn't enough for Donovan. The liquor had loosened whatever restraint he still carried, and his ego was demanding something grander. He needed the room to understand exactly where the power sat. As the clapping thinned and died, those sharp, cold eyes began drifting through the crowd hunting. I already knew the target. His gaze combed the bright tables up front, then drove back through the dim rear of the tent until it found me in my corner. Whatever warmth his face had projected all evening simply switched off. What replaced it was a sneer slow and full of contempt. The microphone gave a faint pop in his grip. He had made a decision the night would not feel finished until he had crushed the man he considered beneath his notice in front of everyone. Donovan turned and caught the eye of a catering attendant, signaling it was time for the cake. A towering 5-tier masterpiece covered in silver leaf and delicate sugar blossoms was wheeled with great ceremony onto the dance floor. Appreciative murmurs moved through the crowd. He lifted the large ornate silver cake knife from the display table, but he never glanced at Sloane. There was no invitation for the traditional cutting together. He drove the knife through a thick slab of vanilla cake, worked it onto a small porcelain plate with force, then pressed the knife back into a rattled waiter's hands. Right hand on the plate, left hand locked around the wireless microphone, he turned away from the cake display and set off with clear, deliberate strides across the length of the crowded ballroom, straight toward my dark corner. The noise of the tent fell away almost completely. Wealthy guests swiveled in their seats, trading uncertain looks, as the groom cut a hard line past their tables. His expensive leather soles hit the wooden floor with a sharp, rhythmic strike. Sloane had gone rigid near the center of the room, the brightness draining from her face as she tracked where her new husband was headed. Vivian watched from a few tables away, a cold, satisfied smile already claiming her features. And then Donovan was there, standing over my small table. He put himself inches from my face, breath-heavy eyes scorched with something beyond anger, a burning, venomous hatred that had been sitting under his skin all evening. I did not get up. My gaze did not move from his. I sat in my cheap suit with both hands loose in my lap, giving him nothing, no fear, no reaction, just a wall of absolute calm. Donovan put the microphone to his mouth, and his voice filled every corner of that tent through the full speaker system. "I have been surrounded by extraordinary people tonight," Donovan said, his tone laced with a sarcasm so thick it was almost visible. "Powerful people. People who have made something of themselves. But a man of real character never forgets those who weren't so fortunate. Generosity toward those who've fallen short, that's what tonight calls for." He never finished the thought out loud. Without any warning, he let the microphone fall from his hand onto the table. He snatched the thick wedge of frosting-laden wedding cake with his bare fist, drove himself forward, and ground it into my face with full force. The dense, wet mass of vanilla cake and buttercream burst across my nose and cheeks, filling my eyes and oozing in thick streaks down the front of my jacket. "I have some cake, Beggar," Donovan bellowed, his voice stripped of any pretense, nothing left but savage, crowing superiority. "Nobody's going to say I let my pathetic father-in-law go hungry at my own wedding." The violence of it cracked through the tent like a thunderclap. 1 second, nothing. Complete breathless silence swallowed the entire room. Then Donovan's groomsmen came apart in loud, vicious laughter that bounced off every draped wall. The ugliness spread outward. Vivian, stationed near the front, let her cold smirk bloom into something that looked like pure victory. My daughter did not make a sound. Sloane stood with both hands pressed to her lips, her eyes wide with horror and disbelief. I held my position without moving a muscle, working the thick frosting away from my eyelids with slow, deliberate movements. Cold cream tracked down onto my collar and soaked into the worn fabric of my shirt. I made no move to stop it. I kept my eyes fixed on his, saying nothing, but every molecule of me was coiled, primed, ready for what came next. The soiled cake slid down my jaw and dropped with a muffled sound onto the white tablecloth. Sugar stuck to my lashes. A heavy ring of frosting dragged at my collar. I left it all where it was. I simply occupied that chair and let the stillness around me grow so dense and so cold that it seemed to pull the air out of the room entirely. Donovan loomed above me with the posture of a man who had just claimed a kingdom, drunk on the sound of his groomsmen howling at my expense. He spread his arms open to his audience and drank in their cruelty. Vivian had settled against a nearby table, watching the spectacle with bright, gleeful eyes, certain she was witnessing the poor mechanic reduced to exactly what she had always believed he was. My daughter had not moved from the dance floor. Sloane looked as though the floor beneath her had crumbled away without warning. The savagery her husband had just shown the room had locked her in place, stolen every word she might have said. Her mouth opened. Nothing followed. Donovan spun away from me, lifting both arms to milk another round of applause from the crowd for his own gratification. That was the moment a chair scraped violently across the marble floor, the heavy boom of it cutting through the fading noise like a gunshot. From a premier VIP table positioned near the front of the stage, an enormous figure rose to his feet. It was Jeffrey Hargrove. Jeffrey was a legitimate, ruthless billionaire real estate mogul, one of the most formidable and connected developers along the entire eastern seaboard. Donovan had clearly dangled an invitation to use him as a prop, a calculated move to borrow credibility from a genuine titan of industry. Jeffrey was not entertained by what he had just witnessed. His face had gone a deep burning crimson. He flung his linen napkin across his plate and set off across the polished dance floor in a straight line. The sheer physical authority of Jeffrey Hargrove silenced the room before he said a word. He was a big, unyielding man who had no patience for nonsense. The remaining murmurs in the crowd instantly died. The wedding band read the shift in atmosphere and cut the music without being told. The silence that settled over the tent was dense and suffocating. Donovan rotated to face him, a faintly puzzled smile pinned to his face, still operating under the delusion that Jeffrey was crossing the room to congratulate him to join in the sport of humiliating the bride's father. He even moved toward him, hand extended in a bid for wealthy solidarity. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Jeffrey thundered, sweeping Donovan's outstretched hand aside, as though brushing away something foul. The raw force of his voice made the crystal chandeliers tremble above us. His eyes blazed with a combination of disbelief and a fury that had nowhere left to go but out. A thick, shaking finger drove straight at Donovan's chest. "Do you have a literal death wish, you stupid, arrogant child?" Donovan physically recoiled, that smug smile fracturing apart on his face. Being verbally detonated by a man he practically worshipped buckled him where he stood. "Jeffrey, I do not understand." Donovan managed his voice, dropping 2 full octaves into a thin, unsteady register. "It was just a harmless joke. He is just a mechanic." "A mechanic." Jeffrey repeated it back like the words had left a bad taste, his voice loaded with venomous disbelief. He advanced another step, pressing Donovan backward until he was up against my small table. "You are without question the most pathetic, oblivious fraud I have had the misfortune of meeting in my entire career. That man seated right there is Garrett Wyndham. He holds the deed to the commercial shipping ports you claim to run your imports through. He built the global logistics empire that moves half the freight along this coastline, and that massive commercial high-rise in Boston that you spent the entire cocktail hour boasting about acquiring. He is the man who bought it outright for cash yesterday morning." The collective gasp that tore through the reception tent was staggering. 200 wealthy socialites, investors, and family members drew breath at the same instant in raw, unfiltered shock. Those words detonated in the air, reducing every fabrication Donovan Ashford had ever constructed to rubble. The revelation hit the room like a missile finding its mark. Vivienne's crystal champagne flute slipped from her fingers. It burst against the marble floor, but she did not even register the sound. Her jaw had gone slack, her complexion draining to a sickly ashen gray, as her eyes darted wildly back and forth between Jeffrey and me. I kept my hands still and flat on the table. I reached for a folded white linen napkin. With slow, unhurried precision, I began clearing the smeared vanilla frosting from my face, my eyes, my cheeks, my chin, letting Jeffrey Hargrove's words do their work, letting the truth squeeze the air out of the groom, one breath at a time. Donovan looked like something vital had been torn clean out of him. The color abandoned his face entirely, leaving him hollow and gray. His arrogant bearing collapsed inward. His breathing came in shallow, rapid pulls. The man who had just driven cake into my face was unraveling in front of 200 witnesses. He turned his head slowly toward me. The untouchable, sneering hedge fund operator was gone. What stood in his place was a terrified boy who had only just understood that he had thrown a punch at the wrong man entirely. His gaze moved over my ruined suit, and for the first time, the real shape of what I had done registered behind his eyes. I had not walked into this wedding as a broken, defeated mechanic. I had come dressed as prey to coax him into a cage he built himself, and he had stepped inside willingly pulled the door shut and turned the lock with his own hands. Sloane moved forward 2 unsteady steps, her expression torn between confusion and dawning devastation. "Dad!" she whispered into the quiet room, her voice barely holding together. "Is that true? Are you Garrett Wyndham?" I set the stained napkin on the table with care. I did not turn to my daughter yet. Every bit of my attention was trained on the trembling, sweat-drenched man in front of me. I pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraped loudly across the floorboards, and rose to my full height. Without the slumped posture of a man who had accepted defeat, my bearing shifted entirely. I straightened my ruined collar and looked down at Donovan. "Jeffrey is entirely correct," I said, barely above a murmur. The unshakable calm packed into those words drove the silence in the room several degrees deeper. Donovan stumbled back, his knees nearly folding under the crushing weight of his own catastrophic miscalculation. He worked his mouth open, reaching for another lie, but there was no ground left under him. The grand, expensive illusion he had so carefully maintained was in pieces. I stepped away from the small table, leaving the ruined cake where it sat, fully prepared to land the final blow. I held his gaze without wavering, letting the weight of the tense silence amplify every drop of terror now radiating from Donovan Ashford. He had counted on me to shrink, to retreat into the shadows with frosting on my collar and my dignity in ruins. Instead, I took a fresh linen napkin from the edge of the table. With methodical, unhurried movements, I cleared the last of the sticky vanilla cake from my face. I dropped the soiled napkin onto the floor directly in front of his expensive leather shoes. The murmurs of the wealthy guests had completely died away. Jeffrey Hargrove stood a few feet off to the side, arms folded across his chest, watching with grim and total satisfaction. Vivienne looked on the verge of collapse, both manicured hands gripping the back of a chair for support. I closed the remaining distance between myself and the man who had believed he could conquer my family. The illusion of the helpless, uneducated mechanic dissolved completely. I stood at my full height, shoulders squared, projecting the quiet iron authority of someone who ran an international empire. Donovan lurched back, a clumsy half-step chest, heaving the full scale of his catastrophic error, finally crashing down on him. I reached into the breast pocket of my damp, ruined jacket. My hand found the thick black leather folder that Callum had passed to me in the alleyway just hours before. I drew it out slowly, letting the silver crest of Wyndham Enterprises catch the chandelier light. Donovan's eyes locked onto it, and a sickening recognition moved across his face. He understood exactly what caliber of documents traveled inside a case like that. Without dropping his gaze, I lifted the folder and threw it squarely at his chest. The heavy binding struck him hard at the sternum. He grabbed for it, but his hands were shaking too badly to hold on. It hit the marble floor and burst open on impact. Confidential legal documents, bank statements, and printed background checks fanned out widely across the polished surface. The full architecture of his fraudulent life lay exposed for every person in that room to read. "Your exclusive elite hedge fund is a complete phantom, Donovan," I said, my voice carrying cleanly and evenly through the silence. "There are no Boston acquisitions. There are no international corporate mergers. Your entire operation is nothing but a legally registered limited liability company with exactly zero assets, zero legitimate clients, and absolutely no trading history. You have been living off a fabricated portfolio using counterfeit bank statements to charm desperate investors and foolish socialites who were too dazzled by your rented suits to look past the surface." The guests nearest the front began whispering urgently among themselves. Several men who had almost certainly handed him their own money went pale and reached immediately for their phones. Donovan's mouth worked open, hunting for some defense, but his throat had seized up completely. He stared down at the scattered papers and understood that every lie he had spun and protected over the last 5 years was now documented permanently across that floor. I pulled my attention away from the trembling coward and fixed it on my daughter. Sloane stood frozen at the edge of the dance floor, tears gathering in her beautiful eyes, her hands still pressed tightly over her mouth. "Sloane," I said, drawing my voice down to something quiet and gentle meant only for her. "I need you to take off that engagement ring right now, sweetheart." Her trembling hands fell away from her face. She looked down at the glittering stone on her finger. I kept going, forcing the truth into the open air. That stone is nothing but glass Sloane, a worthless piece of polished cubic zirconia. 3 months ago, The same week he got down on one knee, the man standing before you slipped into a shady pawnbroker on Jewelers Row. He took the priceless, flawless heirloom diamond your late grandmother entrusted to him and ripped it ruthlessly from its antique platinum setting. He sold your family's legacy for quick, desperate cash, just enough to cover the venue deposit for this very wedding. Sloane let out a sharp, devastated gasp. She pulled the ring from her finger as though the metal had scorched her skin. She held the fake stone up and stared at it, the full weight of the betrayal moving across her face like a tide. She lifted her eyes to Donovan in silence, pleading with him to deny it, to tell her it was some kind of mistake. But Donovan could not bring himself to meet her gaze. He stared at the floor jaw, trembling, and in that silence confirmed every word I had spoken. Vivian let out a loud, theatrical wail, the reality finally breaking through, that her grand social ascent had been underwritten with cheap glass and stolen family heirlooms. She dropped into a nearby chair and buried her face in her hands. The entire room looked on in absolute horror as the charming, handsome groom was taken apart piece by piece, laid bare, as nothing more than a thieving parasite who had preyed on the trusting heart of a young woman. I brought my focus back to Donovan. The time for the final blow had arrived. I moved forward slowly, one deliberate step, closing the space between us, forcing him to look up at me. He was completely cornered. My presence on one side, the gathered crowd of furious guests pressing in on the other. "You did not just pawn a ring to survive," I said, my voice falling to a dangerously low, gravelly whisper with a lethal edge behind every word. "You borrowed exactly $4 million from an incredibly violent syndicate connected to the Russian mob. You were desperate and you were cowardly. So, instead of using your own name, you committed malicious identity theft. You deliberately used my innocent daughter's highly confidential social security number as the primary collateral for your illegal marker. You legally authorized a cartel to drain her entire generational trust fund the moment you inevitably defaulted." Donovan squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear of pure, undiluted fear tracking down his pale cheek. His whole body had begun to shake. He knew the penalty for stealing from those particular lenders was not something a lawyer could talk his way around. But your desperate little game ends tonight. I pressed on each word, landing like a physical strike. As of 6:00 a.m. this morning, my global corporation moved aggressively through the shadow market. We acquired that entire debt portfolio through our untraceable dummy corporations. You no longer owe the Russian mob a single penny, Donovan. You owe me. Your entire pathetic existence belongs to me now. I hold sole absolute ownership of your $4 million marker, and I am calling in every cent of that loan effective right now. You have exactly 10 seconds to absorb that reality before my personal security team removes you from this reception and hands you directly to federal authorities on charges of massive financial fraud and felony identity theft. Run, if you want, like the miserable coward you are. Donovan, get out of my sight and never come near my family again." Donovan did not run. His legs buckled completely beneath him, unable to bear the crushing weight of his own absolute destruction. He crumpled onto the cold marble of the dance floor, his expensive tailored trousers folding awkwardly around his knees. The arrogant, untouchable groom, who had driven cake into my face minutes ago, had ceased to exist. What remained was a broken, sniveling fraud. He crawled forward across the polished stone, closing the distance between us on his hands and knees. His fingers still tacky with the vanilla frosting he had used to humiliate me, reached out in desperation. He grabbed onto the scuffed leather of my steel-toed boots and clutched them as though they were the only solid thing left in his collapsing world. Tears streaked down his pale face, running together with the sweat of his panic. "Please, Mr. Wyndham," Donovan begged, his voice fracturing into a high, pitiful whine that rang through the silent reception tent. "Please, I am begging you. I will do anything you want. I will work for you for the rest of my life. I will be your absolute slave. Just please do not destroy me. Do not let them take me away. I can fix this. I can make everything right." I looked down at the weeping man clinging to my worn boots. There was no pity anywhere inside me, only a deep, thorough disgust. This was the predator who had manipulated my daughter, sold her grandmother's irreplaceable heirloom, and casually pledged her financial future to a violent criminal organization to bankroll his hollow illusions of grandeur. I pulled my boot back slowly and deliberately, letting his grasping hands slide off the worn leather. I stepped away, placing clear distance between my family and his toxic wreckage. You cannot rebuild something that was constructed on pure malicious lies. Donovan, I said coldly, my voice flat and stripped of any feeling, you made every one of these choices with absolute arrogance, certain you were the sharpest mind in every room. Now you will bear the full consequences of those choices. I raised my right hand. I did not raise my voice. I simply snapped my fingers. The crisp, clean sound cracked through the heavy silence of the tent like a dry branch splitting. At once the heavy wooden doors at the main entrance swung wide open. Soft afternoon light flooded in, silhouetting 5 figures advancing with purpose down the central aisle. Leading them was Callum, dressed in his immaculate dark charcoal suit, his expression a mask of total uncompromising authority. Flanking him on either side were 4 federal agents in dark tactical jackets, badges prominently displayed on their belts. The crowd of wealthy socialites drew back, immediately pressing against their decorated tables to open a wide path for the approaching officers. The undeniable sight of federal law enforcement entering a billionaire wedding reception sent terrified murmurs rippling through the elite guests. Callum stopped exactly 2 feet from where Donovan was still kneeling on the marble floor. He regarded the broken groom with mild contempt before turning his full respectful attention to me. "We have the warrants fully secured," Sir Callum stated, clearly passing a thick stack of official judicial documents to the lead federal agent. "The offshore transfers are locked, and the identity theft charges have been formally filed with the federal prosecutor." I gave Callum a single firm nod. "Arrest him for aggravated identity theft, massive wire fraud, and extensive financial conspiracy." I said it quietly, but with the absolute weight of a verdict that had already been handed down. The 2 lead agents moved instantly. They seized Donovan by his expensive suit jacket and hauled him roughly upright. Donovan thrashed hard, panic overriding whatever physical strength remained. "No, wait. Please, you cannot do this to me." Donovan screamed, his voice shattering as the cold steel handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. "Sloan, tell your father to stop." But Sloan simply turned her face away, folding her arms around herself as tears of deep betrayal fell silently down her cheeks. The agents did not pause. They spun Donovan around and began marching him forcefully down the long central aisle of the reception tent. Donovan kicked and wailed, his expensive leather shoes scrabbling uselessly against the polished marble. His desperate, humiliated screams bounced off the beautiful floral arrangements and crystal chandeliers, a perfectly wretched soundtrack to the total collapse of his fraudulent empire. The crowd watched in stunned, breathless silence as the groom was dragged out of his own spectacular wedding and shoved into the back of a waiting federal transport vehicle. As the heavy doors slammed shut behind the agents, a new and frantic energy ignited near the front tables. Vivian had finally clawed her way back from the paralysis of her initial shock. She watched the man, who was supposed to be her golden ticket into high society, hauled away like a common thief. Her calculating mind worked rapidly through the new reality taking shape in front of her. Within seconds, she had grasped the truth that the poor, uneducated mechanic she had mocked and belittled all weekend was, in fact, a titan of industry whose net worth dwarfed anything she had ever let herself imagine. She smoothed her expensive silk dress and fixed a sickeningly sweet, entirely synthetic smile onto her pale face. She nearly sprinted across the dance floor, her heels striking the marble in sharp, rapid clicks as she made a beeline directly for me. "Garrett, darling." Vivian breathed, her voice straining to project warmth it had never once genuinely contained. "My goodness, this is all just so overwhelming. Why on earth did you not tell us who you really were? We could have treated you so much better. We could have arranged something truly magnificent in your honor. We are family after all." I looked straight into her wide, calculating eyes and saw exactly what was swimming just beneath the surface of that desperate smile, pure, undisguised greed. She had no concern whatsoever for the trauma her daughter had just survived. She felt nothing about the criminal conspiracy that had nearly gutted our family. The only thing her mind was running toward was the enormous fortune she believed had suddenly come within reach. I did not return the smile. I let the cold, unsparing truth of the moment settle like a stone between us. "You do not understand the meaning of family, Vivian," I said, my voice dropping to a hard, resonant register that wiped the manufactured warmth right off her face. "I gave you exactly what you asked for. I played the role you assigned to me because that was the only path to dragging the truth into the open. I held her gaze and let my contempt speak for itself. You want to know why I never told you about my wealth? Because you do not love a man, Vivienne. You love a bank account. You always have, and you always will. I stepped past her stunned, pale face, walked around the ruined wedding cake, and crossed the dance floor to reach my daughter. The massive reception tent that had buzzed with the energy of 200 wealthy guests only minutes before was draining fast. Elite socialites and opportunistic investors were clearing the scene of the disaster as quickly as their expensive shoes would allow, whispering among themselves in hushed, nervous voices, each one eager to sever any connection to the wreckage of Donovan Ashford. Waiters in white tuxedo shirts eased silently through the swinging kitchen doors, abandoning their trays of champagne and untouched appetizers. Vivienne, grasping that her elaborate social performance had been reduced to ash, snatched up her designer handbag and nearly ran toward the valet station. She did not look back at her own daughter even once. Within minutes, the magnificent venue stood completely hollow. The jazz trio had packed up and gone. The only sounds left were the soft push of coastal wind against the canvas walls and the quiet, rhythmic sound of someone crying. I crossed the polished marble floor, slowly, my steel-toed boots placing soft echoes in the vast emptiness. The great chandelier above poured its warm golden light down over what remained of the reception, a wreckage of abandoned tables and untouched food. Sloane was alone at a large dining table, her white wedding gown pooled around her on the floor, the beauty of it a brutal contrast to the devastation on her face. She was not crying over losing Donovan. She was far too sharp for that illusion to survive the ugly truth of what he was, had already torn through it. The grief on her face ran deeper. She was weeping from shame. She had watched him shove cake into my face. She had let her mother demean me across an entire weekend. She had stood beside a monstrous predator and never seen him for what he was. And she had allowed the one person who truly loved her to be treated as though he were nothing. I pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. The vanilla frosting still marking my jacket did not concern me. The ruined collar did not concern me. I simply looked at my daughter and waited while she gathered herself. Slowly she raised her head. Her eyes were swollen and raw with a grief that reached right into me. She looked at me, the way she had not looked at me in years, past the worn clothes and the roughened hands down to something real. "Dad," she said, her voice barely holding its shape. "I am so incredibly sorry. I was so completely blind. I let them treat you like you were nothing. I was so caught up in the fantasy, the beautiful dresses, the grand venues, that I could not even see what he truly was. I did not protect you. I should have stood up for you." I did not give her a lecture. I did not bring up the quiet warnings I had offered her about Donovan and his hollow charm. The situation itself had already delivered the hardest lesson of her life, and no words from me could improve on what reality had just taught her. Instead, I reached out and drew her into a long, steady embrace. She pressed her face into my shoulder and wept fully, and I held on without moving, giving her the solid, unshakable ground she needed most. I rested my chin against her hair. "I never kept my wealth hidden to hurt you, Sloane," I said softly. No anger anywhere in my voice. "I hid it to protect you from men exactly like him. The moment people learn you carry serious wealth, something behind their eyes shifts. They stop seeing a beautiful, intelligent young woman and start seeing an open door. They construct an entire version of themselves designed to walk through it. I wanted you to build something real, a life rooted in genuine connection, not financial calculation. I wanted someone to choose you for who you are, not for what your trust fund represents." Donovan was a predator, and predators are extraordinarily skilled at wearing the right disguise. You were not foolish, sweetheart. You were trusting, and he turned that beautiful quality into a weapon. Sloane eased back from the embrace and dragged the back of her hand across her wet cheeks. She looked down at the bare space on her ring finger, then reached into the small silk clutch resting on the table. She lifted out the sparkling engagement ring Donovan had placed there alongside every empty promise he had ever made. She studied the polished glass stone for a long moment, something close to disgust moving across her features. Then she set it carefully into the palm of my hand. "Take it," she said, and her voice was already a little steadier, carrying a new quiet resolve. "I do not ever want to look at it again." I closed my fingers around the worthless piece of glass and slipped it into my pocket. I got to my feet and held out my hand to her. "It is time to go home, Sloane," I said quietly. The illusion is over. It is time to step back into the real world. She took my hand, gathered the heavy skirts of her gown, and rose. Together, we walked away from the abandoned tables, the shattered crystal, and the ruined cake out of the grand hollow palace Donovan had constructed with stolen money and forged signatures. The coastal sun was easing toward the horizon, painting the sky in wide strokes of orange and purple. The manicured grounds were empty in every direction. We passed the deserted valet station and made our way toward the rear service lot. My old rusted 2003 Chevy Silverado sat exactly where I had left it that morning, entirely out of place against the grand stone facade of the estate, and to me, absolutely perfect. I pulled the passenger door open. The hinges gave their familiar creak in the quiet evening air. Sloane climbed in her wedding gown, spreading across the worn, cracked vinyl seat. I shut her door, walked around the front, and settled behind the wheel. I slid the key in and turned it. The old V8 woke with a deep, resonant rumble that moved through the entire frame of the truck. There in that empty lot, the raw, unpolished roar of that engine sounded like the only honest thing I had heard all day, and it sounded like victory. We rolled out of the service entrance and onto the coastal highway, leaving the fraud, the deceit, and the shallow world of Vivian and Donovan receding in the mirror behind us. The months following that day were a season of hard, necessary healing for my daughter. We spent long stretches of time together on the porch of my quiet home, drinking coffee and building our relationship, back from the foundation and free from the toxic grip of Donovan and the suffocating vanity of Vivian. Sloane began finding her way back to herself. She came to work alongside me at Wyndham Enterprises, learning how our global operations actually functioned from the ground up. She came to understand that real success bore no resemblance to rented sports cars or glass engagement rings. It was assembled through patient commitment, uncompromising honesty, and genuine hard work. She learned to manage her trust fund with discipline, putting firm legal protections in place to ensure no one could ever use her finances against her again. As for Donovan Ashford, the federal justice system took him apart completely. The evidence we had assembled was utterly overwhelming. He faced a battery of federal charges, massive wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and criminal conspiracy. The violent syndicate he had gone crawling to for money was also drawn into the investigation, triggering a sweeping crackdown on their illegal lending network. Donovan was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. There were no designer suits or expensive champagne waiting for him there. If you have stayed with me all the way to the end of this story, I want you to know I see you and I am grateful. Looking back on everything that unfolded across those days, I will tell you, honestly, the hardest part was never the humiliation. It was the years of silence, the years of watching my daughter move further away from me while I held everything I knew in my hands and waited. That kind of patience leaves marks, but I believe God places the right moment in front of you when the truth is finally ready to be seen, and that when it arrives, no amount of borrowed money, rented cars, or forged signatures can hold it back. These are the things this journey taught me, and I pass them to you as plainly as I can. Never confuse a man's wardrobe for his character. The loudest person in the room is often the one with the most to hide. If someone works to keep you invisible, let them. Invisibility can be your greatest advantage when the moment comes. Protect the people you love quietly and completely. Real love does not announce itself. It simply shows up when the walls fall. When you feel overlooked, the way so many father stories tell, it dismissed, pushed to the back corner, treated as an afterthought, hold your ground. Dad's revenge is not about anger. It is about the slow, steady work of truth finding its way into the light. If this story stirred something in you, I would be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs to hear it today. A parent, a friend, anyone who has ever felt underestimated. Leave me a comment and tell me what you took from it. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe to His Hidden Revenge and stay close. Thank you for being here. Take good care of yourself, and I will see you in the next story.